So, welcome and good morning, everybody, to the SAP Enable Now Knowledge Transfer session of today, dealing with the topic of publication options and publishing best practices. Before we start, please know that this meeting is being recorded and could be visible by others. So if you don't want your face, your questions, your name, or other personal information being exposed to other non-participants, please disconnect now. Okay, for the sake of GDPR, we did what we could. As always, please jump in any time when you have questions. We have a Q&A session at the end as always, but nevertheless, I believe based on the experience of the last couple of sessions, it makes sense to start discussions immediately if you have a topic on the page that you want to discuss further. All right, so what we talk about is publishing. And publishing is quite an packed name or term within Enable Now. As you see, there is a lot. Published tag, the tag published tag, publishing SCORM, a published library versus a web server publication, and what the hell are videos, and what is a publishing rule, and all this will be sorted out during today's session, at least hopefully. To get all this Babylonic publish and publication terminology nightmare cleared up a tiny bit. So let's see, what is our agenda? First of all, we're going to start discussing infrastructure related things that are related to the publishing issue. So what is a published library on a static web server versus manager-only infrastructures where all accesses go via the manager application? What is the benefits? What is the disadvantages? Because there are still some disadvantages if you compare both solutions, and what you should consider from a consulting perspective in both cases. This will be the theoretical part. So this will only be slideware, where I'm going to go into details regarding the infrastructure variants that we have and tell some stories from the field, and would be happy if you could jump in and explain how you solved the one or the other problem in this context. Then we're going to talk about manager-based publications, the famous publish tag, what it is about, what's the benefits, what's the disadvantages, and then I will put the extended work area feature back on the table, because this is one option to create target group conformant contents in a very easy way, which is available since 2 releases already, but as far as I know, not that much used in the wild yet, unfortunately, because it's quite a powerful thing, at least for cloud customers. And then we're going to talk about the physical publications, which is still a very common way to spread content through the world, create mirrors, create geographical caching locations for content, etc. But this simply needs to be understood. And then, and that will just be a quick walkthrough through the other output formats that we support, that could be published, SLC, executable, what's the difference, what's the document-only publication for, some lines about videos, and then a bit more detail about SCORM and LMS direct interface publications. That would be a suggestion of mine, to put SCORM as a specific topic in one of the not yet planned sessions in early summer, if this is from interest, but you could just put your input into the jam group as mentioned earlier. All right, and then Q&A. And then we are done. As always, if you need a break, if you want to, if you have input, just unmute yourself and talk to me. So let's get started. Enable Now, publishing versus the published tag. What's that? Yeah, sometimes even customers or brand new consultants have issues understanding the differences. Yeah, because as mentioned, publishing is everywhere, so everything seems to be publishable, but there are 2 general things that need to be considered as diametral from a infrastructure perspective, which is manager publication and any other physical publication, which always ends up into a static copy of something. So let's have a look at Manager. Understanding the infrastructure for Manager only. The bottom, the top row on premise shows the most simple infrastructure that we have in place, and that's basically the most common one in the very beginning of a project. You have an on-premise installed Enable Now Manager, whatever component, whatever edition, might be HANA, might be SQL, doesn't matter, which is installed on a server machine within the premises of the customer, within a Tomcat container, and the end user audience, the target groups, they access the content either anonymously or authenticated, depending on the requirement. Anonymously would lead to the fact that we only could count content consumption overall, knowing that if Mr. Miller accesses the same content twice a day, Mr. Miller will be counted as 2 accesses. So it's a real consumption count, not a consumption count per user. And if authenticated, we could do proper reportings. Yeah, so but that's completely free. It's there is no restrictions here. The decision is at the customer. And the authoring team on the right sets the famous publish tag. That means the authors, based on their specific permissions, decide which version of which object is exposed to the outside world, to the end users. And this does not necessarily have to be the latest version of an object, which is a big benefit of the manager-only infrastructure. There will be another slide, the next slide basically, that we're gonna have a closer look to. Okay, bottom line, same scenario basically, but in cloud. So there is the firewall of the customer in between, and both end users and authors, they live on premise, so they are within the infrastructure. So any traffic from them to the Enable Now Manager cloud instance has to pass the firewall. The consumption principle is basically the same. The authoring team decides, based on that famous publish tag, which object version is visible by the end users, and the end users consume content, but only authenticated. That's a big difference between those two infrastructure variants. Officially, there is no anonymous access allowed for cloud-based publications, because basically, from a compliance perspective, we, SAP, are not able to track consumption licenses. That's one reason. And the other reason is that anybody, even competitors of the customer, for instance, knowing the link, would be able to simply access the content without even being tracked. As you all might know, it is still possible for several reasons. But please know, and I just noted that here, that if you want to access open anonymous access for cloud for your customer, it must be a limited period of time. No, for instance, the customer is currently implementing an identity management foundation and an SAML provider, and they are not done yet, but they want to start consuming content. Then we need a written confirmation saying we are currently working on this and that IT project, and it will be done by autumn. So please open anonymous access for us for that period of time. And then a formal confirmation from Enable Now product group is mandatory. So you need an email from either product management or at least from support that allows you to do so. And in that case, you might activate the anonymous access for cloud, but only for that period of time, and tracking to deactivate it again is up on you in that case. Okay, so manager only, it's all about versions. So what's about the versions? But first of all, one big other fact around the cloud manager, which could actually lead to the fact that in the infrastructure discussions with your customer, you would end up in a decision not to use that one manager for the end user access, or only use that one manager for parts of your end user population, and use physically published objects for the others, as we see later. And that's the reason that the Enable Now Manager instance is one server at one physical location. So what we are not doing with Enable Now as a solution, at least right now, is any load balancing or geo balancing throughout all data centers over the world. The customer decides where on the planet his Enable Now Manager instance supposed to be hosted. Yeah, for Europe, it would be one of the German data centers, or in the Netherlands, or wherever. Yeah, and then you would probably be fully okay from a performance perspective for any employee working in Europe. But the Australians would maybe struggle, because any request would travel over the planet, and there could be latency issues that lead to the fact that things become slow. Authors would work slower because synchronization time would take a while. Therefore, we have no solution yet. But end users as well. Yeah, so just think about desktop assistant and big desktop assistant packages. What would happen if the EPSS system initialization time would take a minute just to load the resources from the other side of the world, and that would not be accepted. So in that case, we have to find another solution. So always, based on your general infrastructure decisions, always keep that fact in mind. Just saying it's cloud, so it will work anywhere on the moon, on the Mars, in Australia, is not necessarily the truth. We need to take latency issues and bandwidth restrictions for specific countries of specific regions or specific customer subsidiaries, whatever, into consideration. And if that happens, this is not a product failure, this is just working as designed. In that case, we need to find architectural options to fulfill the requirements of the end user subsets that are located in those remote locations. However, accessing content in that scenario, top line again, anonymous or authenticated, bottom cloud only authenticated, will always happen via deep links. And we're going to go into detail about the deep link magic that we have within Enable Now later in the practical phase. But basically anything, a library, which would be a group that exposes the complete tree as a library to the end user, a book that would be addressed as a course directly, or a single object for a remote support scenario, where a support operator answers a question from a user by sending the deep link to a specific recording, a demo mode, or whatever. This is possible without restrictions here, but the links differ a tiny bit from links used in other scenarios. So let's go ahead. The published tag. Anybody in the room not knowing how that works? Honestly. Does anybody struggle with understanding how our internal versioning concept is working? I just want to know how much detail we need, or how much time we need to spend here. Obviously not. So this is then just repeating what you all should know. In Enable Now, from the perspective of manager, any object, groups, text units, slides, projects, any objects, have a distinct own version history. Based on your settings in the server, versions either will be forced by any change or are time related, or the single author might force a new version if deciding that accordingly. And this version history has two fixed status within. One is the so-called published version, and one is the so-called head version, which is the latest version, which is the version that the authoring team is currently working on. And the most important thing to understand when talk about publication within Manager is that the published tag determines which version of which object the end users might see, which affects both single learning objects, projects, book pages, text units on the bottom of your trees, as well as the structure as such. Because we store structures bottom up, so a group knows its child objects, and if the group is not saved properly after a change, you added a child maybe, if the group is not saved properly and published, you might have a new child within the group and you published that single object, but end users would not see them because the group above was not saved in a new version. We're going to simulate that later. Just want to make sure that you understand this from a theoretical perspective, because this is still on the top 10 list of support. We published, but it's not there. Yeah, you published the object as such. You thought in folders like in Windows, but in fact, what we do is completely the other way around. Our structure does not work as a Windows Explorer. Our structure works completely the other way around. And that's the reason why things like that happen. Okay. However, the link types that we are using, from an end user perspective, we have 3 variants here. And from a authoring perspective, there is only 1. So what's the big difference? End users need to see the published version of each object. So that one version that the authoring team intended to be exposed to the outside. That's a filter within an infinite chain of versions of the single object. And then there could be n in between. The latest one is the head version where the authoring team is currently working on. Okay. So to trigger this, we need the work area permission, view published work area. That's the first prerequisite. Could be forgotten as well. So that leads to the fact that no one sees anything, but you would realize. And then the links that you use for that purpose are those 3. The old world was this instance name. For the common multi-tenant customers, it would be customer enable now cloud SAP. Dot work area slash work area ID or work area name, and then slash tilde tag published. That was the old world. That was like this in since ever, since Manager exists, and that just says filter everything that is underneath this object that we address based on the tag published. So it's quite human readable, but easily forgotten, so things become confusing. However, this is old world. This does not force anything. It says if anonymous access is allowed for on-premise, for instance, then you might access this content anonymously. And if the user is not somehow anonymous, it would still authenticate. No? So if authentication is active, it would try to authenticate. And after that, there would be access denied error if both is not possible. In the new world, since the, I believe some mid of last year, we have 2 new variants for accessing cloud content, which is pub and out that replaces the WA. So within your links, you replace WA with pub to force published access. And you replace WA with AUTH, authenticate, if you want to force authentication, which is far more obvious than the previous syntax. But basically, pub and tag published, they basically do the same. If pub would be chosen and anonymous access to the content would not be allowed, Manager would still try to authenticate the end user before throwing an access denied error. For any author, it's always just work area ID object. Yeah, no out, no pub, no tag published, and all links that do not come with one of those infixes, those links point to the head version of the single object, and this is how the authors would work, how authors would send preview versions of their work to others for review purposes, etc. Yeah, and to access links like that, you need at least any authoring permission. So the minimum set of permissions you need for that purpose would be the SME profile, the subject matter expert profile. Pointing to Info Center, as always, which I realized in the morning that it's quite slow this morning. This is part of the Master Author course. Please consider that the links that will be part of the slide decks that I upload, as always, point to the internal version of the course. So the deep links will only work for SAP internals. For all the others, please check the corresponding chapter in the Learning Hub edition of the course. That image actually shows the same, tells the same story that I told you before, but quite handy even for workshops. Unpublished content for authors only, my domain manager WA name, and then the object deep link. Not forcing, old world, tag published as an infix. Either or, if anonymous does not work, the URL will try to authenticate. And please note, this is what I mentioned earlier already, that the anonymous access per default is deactivated. Forced authenticated access comes with AUTH, out in the middle instead of WA. That means you need to be authenticated, otherwise I won't let you in. That's the most secure one, and that's actually the best practice link type for end users in the cloud world. And then forcing anonymous with the fallback of an authentication, as mentioned earlier, publication. This is more or less similar to the one above. This is just theoretical for now. I leave it open, and we're gonna have a closer look to it from a practical perspective later after our first break. So just one remark. Support asked me to note this again because this is still on the top X list of support. Resources need to be published as well. Any object in Enable Now's world acts in the same way. So resources do so as well. So if an end user would try to access the published version of a specific subtree, like a library, and you would not have published the trainer resource, which is the general e-learning runtime environment, and they would still see nothing because the engine to display would be missing. So please, 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 yeah, always before you open tickets, try to check whether you probably forgot again to publish the resources, and know that resources just behave in the same way as physical contents. The published version would be